I never thought a simple piece of paper could destroy 15 years of my life. But there it was, sitting on the kitchen table, and with just a few lines of text, everything came crashing down. It started like any other day: work, chores, getting Jake, our 14-year-old son, ready for soccer practice. Amy had been quiet lately, but I didn't think much of it. We've had our ups and downs, just like any marriage. You get comfortable, stop noticing the small things, assume everything is fine. But I wasn't ready for what came next. Not by a long shot. I had come home early that day and noticed an envelope from a DNA lab, innocuous, except for the fact that it was addressed to Amy. Curious, I picked it up. I thought it was some kind of medical report or test results for a family history check. But as I read the letter, my hands started to shake, and it felt like the floor was falling away beneath me. Paternity results show a 0% probability of biological relationship between Mark Parker and Jake Parker. I couldn't process it at first. I read it again and again, hoping I was misunderstanding. Jake isn't mine? How could that be? He's my son. I've raised him, taught him to ride a bike, helped with his homework, been there for every scraped knee and every proud moment. How could he not be mine? The front door opened, and Amy walked in, smiling as she unloaded groceries from the car. She stopped when she saw me standing there, holding the letter. Her smile faded instantly. "What's this?" I asked, my voice trembling with barely controlled rage. Amy's eyes widened, her face draining of color as she realized what I was holding. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. "Amy, what the hell is this?" I repeated, my voice rising. She looked like she might collapse right there in the kitchen. After a long, excruciating pause, she finally spoke. "Mark, I can explain," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Explain?" I exploded, throwing the letter down on the table. "You've been lying to me for 14 years. You let me believe Jake was my son, and now I find out that he's not? What kind of person does that?" Tears welled up in her eyes as she struggled to form words. "It was a mistake," she stammered. "It was before we were married. I never meant for this to happen." My hands clenched into fists. "Who is he, Amy? Who's Jake's father?" She hesitated, and I could see the fear in her eyes. She knew that the next words out of her mouth could destroy everything. "Tom," she whispered. I froze. Tom? Her ex? The guy she dated before me, who I had always felt she wasn't completely over. The one who used to call just to check in during the first year of our marriage until I told her to cut him off? I could feel my blood boiling. "Tom? Are you serious? All this time, Jake has been his, and you never told me?" Amy started sobbing, covering her face with her hands. "I didn't know at first," she cried. "I swear, I didn't know. But then, when I realized, I was already pregnant, and you were so happy. I couldn't break your heart. I thought." "You thought what?" I yelled, my voice echoing through the house. "That I just never find out? That we could live happily ever after on a foundation of lies?" She flinched, but I didn't care. I was too angry, too hurt, too betrayed to hold back now. My entire life had been built around this family, around Jake, around Amy, and now it felt like it had all been for nothing. "Does Jake know?" I demanded, my voice shaking with fury. "Has he been living this lie too? Or is he as clueless as I was?" Amy shook her head, still sobbing. "He doesn't know. I swear, he doesn't know." I turned away from her, my mind racing. I needed to get out, to clear my head. Everything I thought I knew had been ripped away from me in an instant, and I didn't know how to handle it. "I'm going out," I muttered, grabbing my keys. Amy called after me, but I didn't stop. I slammed the door behind me, needing to be anywhere but near her. As I drove aimlessly, my mind filled with 1,000 questions. What was I supposed to do now? Jake wasn't mine, but I had been his father for 14 years. Did that count for nothing? Could I just walk away from him? And what about Tom? Would he want to be part of Jake's life now that the truth was out? I had no answers. All I had was the overwhelming sense of betrayal and the bitter realization that my family, my whole life, was built on a lie. I drove for what felt like hours, my mind racing with a toxic mix of rage, disbelief, and deep, gut-wrenching sadness. Jake wasn't my son. Those words echoed in my head, growing louder, angrier, more impossible to accept with every mile that passed. Everything I had built, my family, my marriage, my identity as a father, felt like it had been ripped away from me. I couldn't breathe without the weight of it crushing my chest. Tom, that name burned in my throat. How had he been there, lurking in the shadows all these years without me knowing? How had Amy let this happen? And worse, how had I been so blind? I pulled into an empty parking lot of a rundown gas station, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. What was I supposed to do now? I had raised Jake as my own, loved him like my own flesh and blood, and now I was supposed to just accept that he wasn't mine? I didn't know how long I sat there, staring blankly at the dashboard, before my phone buzzed in the passenger seat. I glanced down to see Amy's name flash across the screen. I ignored it. I couldn't deal with her right now. The anger I felt toward her was overwhelming, but beneath that, buried deep under layers of fury, was something far worse. A crushing sense of loss. I had lost her too, hadn't I? Hours later, when the sun had long set and the cold night air began to creep into the car, I finally went home. The house was dark when I walked in, the silence heavy with unspoken words. Amy was sitting on the couch, her knees pulled to her chest, her eyes red and swollen from crying. She looked up when she heard the door, her face a mixture of guilt and fear. "Mark," she whispered, standing up as if she wanted to come to me, but something in my face stopped her. "I didn't mean for this to happen. I swear, I didn't. I thought—" "You thought wrong," I snapped, cutting her off. "You thought you could live a lie and that everything would be fine, that I'd never find out, that Jake would never find out." She flinched, but I didn't care. I was too angry, too broken to care. "I'm going to tell him," I said, my voice cold. "He deserves to know." "No," she gasped, shaking her head, her voice frantic. "Please, Mark, don't do this. Not yet. He's just a kid. He won't understand. Let's figure this out first, please." I stared at her, feeling nothing but contempt. "Figure what out? There's nothing to figure out, Amy. You lied to me for 14 years. You let me believe he was mine. He's not. He is yours," she said, stepping closer, her voice desperate. "Maybe not biologically, but you're the one who's been there for him. You're his dad, Mark. That hasn't changed." I laughed bitterly. "Hasn't changed? Everything has changed." I walked past her, unable to look at her any longer, and headed upstairs. I stood outside Jake's door, listening to the faint sound of his video game through the walls, and my heart ached. How was I supposed to tell him? How was I supposed to shatter his world the way mine had just been shattered? I took a deep breath, knocked softly, and opened the door. "Hey, Dad," Jake called over his shoulder without looking away from the screen. "You okay? You were out late." I stood in the doorway, frozen. He called me Dad, so casually, like it was the most natural thing in the world. And for him, it was. But for me, it felt like a knife twisting in my gut. "Yeah, buddy," I said, my voice catching. "Can we talk for a minute?" Jake paused his game and spun around in his chair, sensing something was off. "What's up?" I hesitated, my throat tightening. How could I do this to him? How could I tell him the truth, knowing it would rip apart everything he thought he knew? "Jake, there's something I need to tell you," I began, my voice shaking. "Something about your mom and me, and about you." His brow furrowed, confusion flickering across his face. "What do you mean?" I took a deep breath, steadying myself for the blow. "You know I love you, right? I've always been here for you. Always will be." "Yeah," he said, the confusion deepening. "Of course. What's going on, Dad?" I swallowed hard, my heart pounding in my chest. "Jake, you're not, biologically, you're not my son." The words hung in the air between us, and for a moment, Jake just stared at me, his face blank with shock. "What?" "Your mom." I struggled to find the right words, but there were no right words. "Before we were together, she had an affair. With someone else. A man named Tom. And he's your biological father." The silence that followed was suffocating. Jake stared at me, his eyes wide, his mouth open in disbelief. "What are you talking about?" he finally whispered. "That doesn't make any sense. You're my dad. You've always been my dad." "I know," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "I've always been your dad. But biologically, you're his son, not mine." Jake's face crumpled, and I could see the confusion and pain crashing over him. "No," he said, shaking his head. "No, that's not true. You're my dad. You have to be." I reached out to him, but he pulled away, standing up from his chair, his eyes filled with tears. "Why didn't you tell me?" he cried, his voice trembling. "Why did you lie to me?" "I didn't know," I said quickly, trying to explain. "I just found out, Jake. I swear, I didn't know." He stared at me, his chest heaving with anger and heartbreak. "And Mom? She knew this whole time? She lied to both of us?" I couldn't answer. I didn't need to. He already knew. Jake pushed past me, storming out of the room and down the stairs. I heard the front door slam behind him, the sound echoing through the house like a final, crushing blow. I stood there in the silence, my heart shattered. I had lost him. My son, the boy I had raised and loved for 14 years, was gone, and I had no idea how to fix it. I stood in the silence of the empty house, my head pounding, my chest heavy with the weight of everything that had happened. Jake had run out, and I had no idea where he'd gone or how I'd ever fix this. How do you fix a lie that's been festering for 14 years? How do you explain to your son that the man he thought was his father, the man who thought he was his father, isn't? I sank onto the couch, the reality settling in like a slow, relentless wave. Amy came downstairs a few minutes later, her face streaked with fresh tears. I didn't want to see her, didn't want to hear any more of her excuses. "Mark, we need to talk," she whispered, standing in the doorway, looking fragile, almost broken. "We can't leave it like this. Jake, he's devastated." I didn't respond. My mind was a mess of anger, heartbreak, and confusion. How could she have lied to me for so long? How could she let me raise Jake, let me love him like my own, when she knew the truth? "I didn't mean for this to happen," Amy said, taking a hesitant step closer. "You have to believe me. I didn't plan any of this. I didn't want to hurt you." I laughed bitterly. "Didn't want to hurt me? You've been hurting me for 14 years, Amy. Every day you let me believe Jake was mine. You were lying to me. You were lying to him. How could you?" Tears streamed down her face as she sat beside me, reaching out, but I pulled away. I couldn't bear her touch. "Not now. I thought I was doing the right thing," she said, her voice shaking. "You were so happy when I told you I was pregnant. I thought we could make it work. I didn't know how to tell you the truth without destroying everything." "Well, congratulations," I snapped. "You destroyed everything anyway." For a while, we sat in silence, the only sound in the room the ticking of the clock on the wall. The weight of the years we'd spent together pressed down on me, suffocating. I had loved her, trusted her. I had built my entire life around our family, around Jake, and now it felt like none of it was real. After a long pause, Amy spoke again, her voice barely a whisper. "Tom's been asking about Jake." I froze, my blood turning to ice. "What?" "He reached out a few months ago," she admitted, guilt etched into every word. "He didn't know about Jake at first, but when he started asking questions, I didn't know how to keep him away. He suspects something, Mark." My hands clenched into fists. Of course, it wasn't enough that Tom had fathered my son. Now he wanted to be part of Jake's life. The thought of him stepping into our lives, trying to claim Jake, sent a surge of rage through me. "I swear, I didn't tell him anything," Amy added quickly. "But he wants to meet Jake." "Over my dead body," I growled. "He's not stepping anywhere near Jake." Amy bit her lip, her eyes wide with fear. "Mark, I don't know how much longer we can keep this from him. Tom is persistent. If he finds out the truth, he could—" She didn't finish the sentence, but I knew what she was implying. If Tom found out, he could take Jake away from me, not legally, but emotionally. If Jake knew that Tom was his real father, how long would it be before he started to drift away, start to resent me? I couldn't let that happen. I wouldn't lose him to that man. I'll talk to Jake, I said, standing up abruptly, but Tom stays out of this. Jake doesn't need to know anything more. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept replaying every moment over and over. How I told Jake, his reaction, the devastation in his eyes. And now, the looming presence of Tom, the man who had been a shadow in the background of our lives, now threatening to take everything from me. By morning, I made my decision. I knocked softly on Jake's door. He opened it, his eyes red from crying, his face pale with exhaustion. "Can we talk?" I asked quietly. He shrugged and sat on the edge of his bed, not looking at me. I took a seat beside him, unsure of where to begin. "I know this is hard," I said, my voice low. "I know you're angry, and you have every right to be. But I need you to understand something. No matter what happens, no matter what the biology says, I'm still your dad. I'm the one who raised you, who's been there for you every day of your life." Jake was silent for a long time before finally speaking. "What about him? What about Tom?" My heart sank at the mention of his name. "You don't need to worry about him," I said quickly. "You don't need him. You have me. But he's my real dad, right?" Jake asked, his voice shaky. "Doesn't that mean something?" I looked at him, my chest tight with fear. I didn't know how to answer that. Of course it meant something. Biologically, it meant everything. But in my heart, I couldn't let it mean more than what we already had. "Being a dad isn't just about biology," I said carefully. "It's about being there. And I've been there for you, Jake, every step of the way. That doesn't change just because of what we found out." Jake wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, his voice trembling. "I don't know what to do, Dad. I don't know who I am anymore." His words broke me. I reached out, pulling him into a tight hug. "You're my son," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. "That's who you are." But even as I said the words, I couldn't shake the growing fear in my chest. I knew it wouldn't be that simple. Tom was out there, waiting, and sooner or later, this truth was going to tear our family apart even more. The days that followed were filled with a tense silence. Jake barely spoke to either of us, and Amy and I were like strangers in our own home. I couldn't look at her without feeling a fresh surge of anger, a reminder of everything she'd hidden from me for over a decade. But my rage was no longer just directed at her. Now it had a new target, Tom. I couldn't stand the thought of him stepping into Jake's life, claiming any part of what I'd built with my son. But Amy's words kept gnawing at me. "Tom is asking about Jake. How long could we keep him out of this? How long before Tom decided to push his way into our lives, into Jake's life, and blow everything apart?" One evening, after another quiet dinner where no one could look each other in the eye, I heard my phone buzz. I glanced down at the screen and saw an unknown number. Normally, I would have ignored it, but something told me to pick up. "Mark Parker." The voice on the other end was calm, but I recognized it instantly. "Tom." My blood turned cold. "What do you want?" I growled, gripping the phone tighter. "We need to talk," Tom said, his tone steady, like he had the upper hand. "About Jake." "I have nothing to say to you," I snapped. "Jake is my son. You don't get to waltz in here after 14 years and claim him." Tom paused for a moment before replying. "I'm not trying to take him away from you, Mark. But the truth is out now, and Jake has a right to know who I am. I'm not asking for much. I just want to meet him." A wave of nausea hit me. I had been dreading this moment, the inevitable confrontation with the man who had fathered my son without even knowing it. But the idea of Tom getting close to Jake made my skin crawl. "You think you can just walk in and be a father after all this time?" I spat. "You're nothing to him." "I'm his biological father," Tom said, his voice calm but firm. "That means something." I clenched my jaw, my pulse racing. "No, you don't get to decide what it means. I've been there for Jake every single day of his life. I'm his father, and I'm not trying to take that away from you," Tom said, his voice softening slightly. "But Jake deserves to know the whole truth, and he deserves to meet me. Whether you like it or not, I'm part of his life now." I felt the rage boiling inside me, threatening to spill over. Tom's words stung more than I wanted to admit because, deep down, I knew he was right. No matter how much I hated it, no matter how much I wanted to protect Jake from this man, Tom was a part of the story now, and Jake had every right to meet him. But that didn't mean I had to like it. I need time, I said through gritted teeth. This is a lot for Jake to process. We're not rushing into anything. Of course, Tom agreed, though there was something smug in his tone that made my skin crawl. Take all the time you need. But I'm not going anywhere, Mark. I'll be here when Jake's ready. I hung up without saying another word, my hands trembling with anger. The room felt stifling, the walls closing in around me. I could hear Amy moving around in the kitchen, oblivious to the storm raging in my head. I couldn't keep this from Jake forever. Tom was right about that. But the thought of sitting Jake down, telling him that his biological father wanted to meet him, made me feel like I was handing over a piece of my soul. The next morning, I decided to face the inevitable. I sat down with Amy at the kitchen table, the same table where our lives had unraveled just a few days ago. She looked exhausted, worn down by the weight of her guilt. I talked to Tom, I said, cutting straight to the point. Amy's eyes widened, fear flickering across her face. What did he say? He wants to meet Jake, I replied, my voice flat. And he's not going away until he does. Amy's hands shook as she placed her coffee mug on the table. Mark, I'm so sorry. I didn't know how to handle this. I never thought it would come to this. I looked at her, feeling a bitter mix of anger and sadness. Well, it has. And now we have to deal with it. Amy nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. What do we do? I ran a hand through my hair, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on me. We can't keep this from Jake. Not anymore. He has to know that Tom wants to meet him, but it's his choice. I'm not forcing him into anything. Amy sniffled, wiping her eyes. Do you think he'll want to meet him? I didn't answer right away. I didn't want to admit it, but I was terrified of Jake's decision. What if he wanted to meet Tom? What if he started to drift away from me, curious about the man who shared his DNA? What if Tom tried to take my place? I don't know, I said quietly, but we have to give him that choice. That evening, Jake came home from school, still distant, still carrying the weight of everything I'd told him a few days ago. I called him into the living room, and Amy and I sat down together, waiting for the right moment. Jake, there's something else we need to talk about, I began, my heart pounding. He looked at me, his eyes wary, bracing for another blow. Tom knows, I said carefully. He knows that you're his biological son, and he wants to meet you. Jake's eyes widened, and for a moment, I saw panic flash across his face. What? Why? I took a deep breath. Because he's your biological father, Jake. And now that he knows, he wants to meet you. But you don't have to. It's your choice. No one's forcing you to do anything. Jake sat there, staring at the floor, his shoulders tense. I could see the gears turning in his mind, trying to process everything. He didn't speak for what felt like an eternity. Do you want to meet him? Amy asked softly, her voice trembling. Jake looked up, his eyes filled with confusion. I don't know. I don't know what to think. Neither did I. Jake sat there, silent, staring at the floor as the weight of the truth settled over him. I couldn't tell what he was thinking. His eyes flicked between Amy and me, searching for something. Answers, maybe, or reassurance. But we had none left to give. This was his decision now, and the gravity of it felt like it might crush us all. I don't know what to do, Jake finally muttered, his voice shaking. I don't even know him. I wanted to jump in, to say something, anything, to convince him not to meet Tom. But I held back. This wasn't about me anymore. It was about Jake, and I couldn't make this choice for him. I had to respect whatever he decided, even if it tore me apart. We understand, I said, keeping my voice steady. You don't have to decide right now. Take your time. But time was the one thing we didn't have. I could feel it slipping away, faster than I could control. Tom was out there, waiting, his presence a ticking bomb, and I knew that sooner or later, everything would blow up. I just didn't know when, or how bad the damage would be. Days passed in a blur. Jake withdrew even more, avoiding us, spending more time with friends or locked in his room. Amy and I barely spoke. The house felt like it was on the verge of collapsing under the weight of all the unspoken words between us. And then, one night, the phone rang. It was Tom. I want to see Jake, he said bluntly, no pretense, no attempt to soften the blow. He needs to meet me. I could feel my blood boiling, my grip tightening on the phone. He's not ready, I said through gritted teeth. And you need to back off. There was a pause on the other end, and then Tom's voice came, quiet but firm. Mark, I'm not the enemy here. I have a right to see my son. He's not your son. I shouted, the words escaping before I could stop them. He's mine. Tom didn't respond right away, but when he did, his voice was calm. I know this is hard for you, but we both know the truth. And whether you like it or not, Jake's going to want to know where he comes from. I hung up the phone without saying another word, my chest heaving with anger. I couldn't do this anymore. I couldn't sit by and watch as my family unraveled. I had to do something. The next morning, I was ready to confront Tom face to face. I wasn't going to let him swoop in and take Jake from me, not without a fight. I drove to his office, anger fueling every step as I walked in, determined to settle this once and for all. When I found him, sitting in his sleek, modern office, he looked up, surprised to see me. Mark, he said slowly, standing. What are you doing here? I didn't waste time. You're not going near Jake, I growled, my fists clenched at my sides. I don't care what the DNA says. You're not part of his life. Tom sighed, shaking his head. I'm not trying to replace you, but you can't erase me either. I'm his biological father. He has a right to know me. I stepped closer, my voice low and dangerous. You think you can just walk in and be a father because of some blood test? You weren't there for him. You didn't raise him. You don't know him. And whose fault is that? Tom shot back, his eyes narrowing. I didn't know. I wasn't given the chance. The words stung more than I wanted to admit, but I wasn't backing down. You're too late, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He's mine. Tom stared at me for a long moment, and for the first time, I saw something shift in his expression, something that looked almost like regret. Mark, I didn't come here to destroy your family. Then why are you doing this? I snapped. Because I have a right to know my son, he said softly, just like he has a right to know me. When I got home that night, Jake was waiting for me. He looked tired, like he hadn't slept in days, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet, almost fragile. I want to meet him, Jake said, his eyes searching mine for understanding. I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. This was it, the moment I'd been dreading, the moment I might lose him. But I couldn't stop him. Not now. Are you sure? I asked, my voice barely holding steady. Jake nodded. I need to know. I need to figure this out. My chest tightened, but I forced myself to nod. Okay, I said quietly. We'll set it up. The day Jake was supposed to meet Tom was one of the longest of my life. I didn't go with him. I couldn't. I stayed home, pacing the house, feeling like my entire world was about to collapse. When Jake came back later that evening, he was quiet, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. I didn't ask him how it went. I wasn't sure I wanted to know. But then, after what felt like hours of silence, Jake finally spoke. He's okay, Jake said, his voice hesitant. But he's not you. I looked at him, my heart aching with a mixture of relief and sadness. You're my dad, Jake said, his voice stronger now. You're the one who's always been there for me. And that's what matters. Tears stung my eyes as I pulled him into a tight hug, holding on like I'd never let go. Jake had made his choice, and in that moment, I knew that no matter what, we would be okay. But just as I started to feel that sense of relief, Amy walked into the room, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear. There's something else, she whispered, her voice trembling. Something I haven't told you. I turned to her, my heart sinking. What? Amy's hands shook as she pulled a letter from her pocket. Tom, he's not who you think he is. What are you talking about? I asked, my voice rising. He's dangerous, Mark, Amy whispered, her voice cracking. That's why I kept him away. That's why I didn't tell you the truth. I was protecting you and Jake. My blood ran cold as I stared at her, realizing that everything I thought I knew was about to change again. What do you mean, dangerous? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Amy looked at me, her eyes full of fear. There's more to Tom's past than you know. And now he wants more than just to meet Jake. The room spun as her words sank in. Just when I thought things couldn't get worse, a new threat loomed over us, darker and more dangerous than I ever could have imagined.